I feel that society puts too much emphasis on the final destination, whereas the journey of life and all its richness and torture and blood and guts and viscera and sharp objects that are quite dangerous, that's what it's really about, man. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week I plan to bring you in-depth insight into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, today we have a great panel with you to discuss the film Final Destination Bloodlines. Our very talented guests include producers Craig Perry and Sheila Hanahan Taylor, along with co-writers Guy Busick and Lori Evans Taylor. This was a really fun episode. We recorded it before the film came out and held it for the spoiler embargo. And what was one of the fun things about Final Destination's Bloodlines, it's that it's a great reboot. You don't have to do any homework to go see this movie. You just got to walk in the theater, sit down, and have fun. That said, it's a very thoughtful reboot that really pays attention to the lore that comes before it. Yet it has the freedom to go in new directions that the franchise has not gone to before, which I think is why the film became such a success opening weekend. Without a doubt, Craig, Sheila, Guy, and Lori were very forthcoming about their creative process and what it took to get this film made, so I know you'll dig this episode. Of course, I want to thank today's sponsor, Final Draft, and the Big Break Screenwriting Contest, and the final deadline is upcoming. It's June 9th, 2025. Enter now for the possibility to share in over $80,000 in cash and prizes. Winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold and optioned screenplays, and been staffed in TV writers' rooms. All you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more about the Big Break Screenwriting Contest by visiting finaldraft.com. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you'll check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. It's our 13th year of being a magazine, and we couldn't have done it without you. Heck, it's my 20th year of podcasting, so again, I couldn't have done it without you. And look, this is my passion project. If you've never read us, you could test drive us by reading the free issue through our Backstory app on iPads worldwide or via backstory.net on a desktop or laptop. And there's plenty to explore, and we're always adding new stuff into our issues between publishing each issue, so there's always something going on. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see us talking to each other. It would really mean a lot to me to have you show your support for independent entertainment journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with producers Craig Perry and Sheila Hanahan Taylor, along with co-writers Guy Busick and Lori Evans Taylor, about their latest film, Final Destination Bloodlines, which you could see in theaters right now. Craig, Sheila, Lori, Guy, it's good to have you guys. We have a lot to talk about. How y'all doing?
Good.
Very well.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Pretty great. Very excited to be here.
There are a lot of family secrets that are discussed in this film. I think the one to bring up right now, right off the top, is that I am the demon child of Craig Perry because I was his intern many years ago at Silver Pictures. We're starting with you, Craig. I want to introduce folks to you. Who are you? From when dost thou hail? Where did you go to school? Did you study writing? Tell us your tale.
I was born in Massachusetts. I went to Syracuse University for television, radio, and film production, and I came out to Los Angeles. My first job was in the mailroom at New Line Cinema, oddly enough, and I wound up working at Silver Pictures, and that's where you and I met. And I got into the development shuffle and did that for a number of years, working both for Joel Silver and then for Scott Rudin as a development executive. I had the opportunity to work on a whole bunch of very interesting and eclectic movies, and then wound up getting involved in this franchise in 1997 based off of a 3-page outline that was faxed to me. So
it was an outline.
Yeah.
That's very wild and crazy. I mean, you know, obviously I was writing coverage for you, and
Sure.
I did that for you at Rudin as well for a little while. You definitely have seen a lot in the development sphere, I would say. What was something that you picked up early on about reading a script? Because Sheila, I'm going to ask you the same question in a second. Do you believe that it's true that it's got to hit in those first 10 pages, or you have such a stack that's so hard to deal with that you're not going to read the rest of the script unless something in the first 10 pages grabs you? Or is that an old wives' tale? Because not every script always does that.
I would say that you know within the first 5 pages whether you're in good hands in terms of the writing, whether the person makes you feel safe, that they are taking you confident confidently on a journey, both in terms of story and character. Now, be that a explosive moment or even a quiet, precise moment of character that makes you go, oh, I'm interested in what's going to happen to that person. But by page 15 or 20, if the reason the movie is supposed to exist hasn't quite happened yet, I'm starting to get pulling back. I'm like, I don't know. But I usually then flip forward to like page 30 or 40 and say, okay, did it happen late? We can always help somebody restructure something to get to the like reason the movie exists. But the writing itself is the most important thing. If the writer knows what they're doing, you can always help them better craft what beat by beat of the plot is. But if they don't know how to even execute that, you're just working from nothing. So usually I give it to page 40, but I'm most excited when I get to page 60 because that means there's a movie happening and I can't wait to finish it.
Sheila, to my knowledge, you started acting in the 90s. I know your first credit was Exit to Eden. You eventually produced movies. You did Replicate in 2003 and then started working with Craig on Final Destination 2, I believe. Tell us your story.
Yeah. So let's rewind. So I actually was in Screen Actors Guild starting when I was 7 years old. I was a lead actor doing commercials in Michigan, home of all the car companies. So I was the happy cheerleader in many minivan commercials, as well as a ton of voiceover work for local department stores and stuff like that. So I was a theater nerd and a movie nerd always. When I was in college, my boyfriend and I broke up and I couldn't get out of bed. I was super depressed and I didn't have a vision of how to get through it. And I had an older sister living in Chicago and she was like, you're coming to summer intern somewhere here. And I landed at Steppenwolf Theater and I was a writer's assistant for the whole summer. But the craziest thing was, as much as a theater nerd that I was, it wasn't a Hollywood, or it wasn't a Steppenwolf summer. It was a Hollywood summer because they brought in all these LA guys who were doing a play. So I ended up as a writer's assistant for Gary Marshall. And this is right after Pretty Woman. And during the summer that Babalu Mandel and Lowell Gans, who were writing this play at Steppenwolf with him, were writing City Slickers. So I was their writer's assistant working on like big comedies by day and on the play with them at night. And then I finished my senior year and then they had me come out to Hollywood to be their writer's assistant. So that's how I got to LA.
That's awesome.
If you'd asked me, I was going to be a theater person living in New York. So the whole thing was never planned, but it's obviously worked out really well. I did do a little bit more acting out here, but honestly, I was a reader and working as a writer's assistant always. And I worked for the Zucker brothers for a while. So I was with them during the My Best Friend's Wedding era. So I did a lot of Julia Roberts stuff.
Okay.
So trafficking in the Julia Roberts big comedy space. And I found my way to working with Craig. Honestly, the summer they had already shot American Pie. And so I landed there when they had the day after they had their first test screening for Pie. And I believe it had scored a 98 and they were locking picture, right? Give or take. Am I about right on that, Craig? And so I started working there in Thanksgiving of 98. Final Destination was real at that point, but there, it hadn't started casting or anything, but it was kicking off. So I came in post American Pie 1, but pre Final Destination 1. And then he and I have worked together ever since.
That's awesome. And it's funny that you mentioned Gary Marshall, his love of theater. It's always, persevered. And the Gary Marshall Theater here in Burbank, like over here in California, it's still fantastic. They're still doing great stuff, even after he's passed away and his name lives on, which is awesome.
Yeah, his daughter, who went to Northwestern, is a true theater lover, and she's helping run it and curate the slate, and they do summer camp and all sorts of fabulous things. So they're definitely keeping the torch burning, for sure.
Lori, tell us your tale. I know that you and Guy, your first writing credit together was on Desire, the 2006 TV show. So you have this television past. So tell me how you led to that moment of meeting Guy and writing on Desire, and then same question to you, Guy.
Just to start off, I, like Sheila, was a theater geek. I was a theater nerd. That's what I came up in. I love theater in high school, but I loved movies more. But I grew up in North Carolina away from Hollywood. So it was this love that I had, but theater was the thing I could do. And then when I was in college, I was a theater major at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In my spare time, though, I worked at a video store back when there were actual video stores. And so I worked there and just consumed as much film as possible. And then when I graduated, when all my friends went to New York City, I love theater, but I'm drawn by this idea of film, of movies. And so I came out here as an actor and also as part of theater. I produced and I directed theater. And then on the side, I started writing to kind of get my yayas out because I love story. And I always grew up a big horror fan. I loved horror. I loved thrillers. So I started writing some from there. And that's how I broke into the industry. My big break was Bed Rest, which was a contained horror thriller that was on the blacklist. And it was an exciting moment where on a Tuesday, nobody knows your name, and the script goes out, and by Friday, everybody in town knows your name. And so it was a really exciting experience as a writer to get out there and to get known. And that's how I met Craig, had a general
We had lunch about a couple weeks after that.
Yeah,
Nice.
and so that's how we met, and then later on, I ended up working with both Craig and Sheila on a thriller called Cellar Door. So that's how I met them. And then with Guy, so Guy and I went back even before Desire. So we have a mutual friend group, bunch of friends who knew each other. A lot of them went to USC, and so Guy and I were friends. And then one of our friends ended up working on the show and needing writers, and so we were both brought on, and so that was the first time he and I worked together back in the telenovela days.
Telenovela days, that's right. And it's funny that you mentioned North Carolina. I went to USC for theater and film. I'm a lifelong theater geek as well, and I am proud to say that my son inherited the theater geek gene. And you talked about North Carolina. He's going to University of North Carolina School of the Arts to study lighting design, which is basically the Harvard of lighting design. Because I've investigated every single college's curriculum, and they teach the most lighting design, and they do not let adults come in and lighting design their shows. It is student designers only. So that's my North Carolina connection now, I guess.
He's going to have a blast.
Yeah, I toured it this spring before he made his decision. I was blown away by it. I was very impressed. It's like an artistic bubble in the middle of North Carolina. It's awesome. Guy, tell us your tale. Where are you from, and what did you study in school?
Well, first, I have to say, as soon as I popped on and saw your background as being the Black Lodge, I liked you already. And I don't know if you can see it because it's very small, but that's a Twin Peaks lunchbox right there. And then the other side of this bookshelf has a whole like Twin Peaks section. So we're definitely simpatico. I wish I could say, be mysterious and be like, I'm from parts unknown, like the Ultimate Warrior in the WWF in the old days. But no, I'm just from Nebraska. It's pretty boring. It's very flat and a lot of cows, but a good place to grow up. So yeah, it's really interesting how much overlap there is with a lot of us on here, because I am the third theater nerd. That was what kind of got me started. I also loved movies always since I was like 5. So that was a big part of it. And then the way I got into that USC friend group, I actually came out to Pepperdine on an acting scholarship and got a theater degree. But my good friend Ryan, who I wrote Ready or Not with, and the sequel Ready or Not 2 shooting now, coming soon, he went to USC. And so through him, I met that mutual group of friends that Lori was talking about. And then one of us got us onto those telenovelas. And that was quite a wild experience, which, we could do a whole podcast on that probably. But in terms of like making the shift into writing, this is really weird, but I interned for Scott Rudin in the summer between, I think, my junior and senior years of college. And I was always interested in writing and had done a lot of creative writing as a kid and whatever. But one of the things I did was, Rudin, for all the things that are bad about Scott Rudin, which that's another podcast, he had great taste in material. And so he would option, books and plays and things like that. So I was like, what can I learn from all of the things he buys and makes into movies? What do they have in common? What makes a quality screenplay? And so I would just copy and take home dozens of scripts that I wasn't supposed to take and just kind of learn that way, because I didn't have any formal writing training. And then part 2 was I worked at a video store too. It was Idiots in Santa Monica in the late 90s. I worked there. And so then I would just like pick a filmmaker, take home all of their movies for a week or whatever. I got free rentals. So that was sort of my film school between Rudin and Vidiots. I was not a horror kid like Ryan was. And so when we met when we were 13, like he would show me all the horror stuff. I started out writing rom-coms and sci-fi. And my first horror script was the one that kind of got me noticed. When that went out, it was the same sort of thing where it was like, no one knows who you are. And then all of a sudden you have all these general meetings and try to parlay that into a career. And then just kind of chipped away here and there and eventually landed on, well, what's a genre that never goes away? It's horror. You don't need a star. You don't need a huge budget. You could do, a contained setting and it can get made. And Ryan and I at the time were writing like these big $100 million sci-fi epics, and they were good and we'd make money selling them or getting those jobs. They'd never get made because there was no IP to support a $100 million movie. It was like based on a short film or an original idea. So we're like, let's, screw it. Let's go back to, the opposite. Let's do it like a $5 million or under movie. And that's how we came up with Ready or Not. And then when that came out, things kind of broke broke open for me, and it brought me into the orbit of Craig and Sheila on Final Destination. I don't want to get ahead of the questions or anything, but the first time we all talked, FD was on a virtual room or roundtable, if you will, based on a little treatment by the brilliant John Watts. And it was kind of a, hey, let's get some horror writers together in a virtual room, because it was during the pandemic. Let's all pitch on it. And those are really fun. New Line likes to do those, so I always jump at the opportunity.
We'll get to that in 1 second. But wait, were you at Scott Rudin when Craig was there?
I think it was probably a little after. It would have been summer 97 for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gone just at the top of 96. My last set of notes was on Wonder Boys. That was the last thing I did notes.
Oh, nice. Oh, one more thing, overlap. I was an assistant at New Line when in the early on. Scott Canyon was a business affairs guy. I think we might have talked about this. I was just doing assistant work to pay the bills as I was getting the writing going. And I spent a couple of years at New Line, and I was there at the same time, oddly, as the Radio Silence guys, who I then went on to make a bunch of movies with. And we didn't meet while we were there, but they were all like mailroom or assistants just like me. It was just like this weird nexus in the early aughts.
He was over the other post-production. He was in the physical production campus.
He was on the other building. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's right.
The other North Robertson one. So I just want to add, I also worked at a video store. So we're just, just to add all the overlap continues.
Well, I went to video stores a lot, but I worked at a movie theater, so I have that for me. I was actually an usher at the Die Hard premiere. How's that for being old?
Which theater, though, did you work at, Craig?
The Avco out in Westwood. When it was an actual real theater, they did like real premieres there.
Yeah. No, I remember the Avco. I mean, the Avco was great. The only two Scott Rudin things that I would add here is one of the last things that I did for you, Craig, that I've still talked about to my friends all these years later is, well, first off, I knew not to go into the office. I would get scripts sometimes, like I would have to go pick them up. It's before we were emailing scripts or they would be couriered. But there was a terrible story about somebody that was almost just about legally blind that was an assistant, and he was like fired and hired and fired again in the same day by Scott. I was hearing about that at the time, and people are like, the last place you want to be is in this office. If you could avoid it, avoid it. Like, we'll see you out at a movie or something. I'm like, okay. But the craziest thing Craig ever did to me as an intern, which by the way I loved, was there was just be these crazy deadlines. And at one point they wanted me to read a book. It was Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is a great classic comedy. I'm like, what? Wait a minute. We don't need to remake this. What are we doing? And they're like, okay, we're currying you the book. I'm like, okay, fine. I'm like, so I'll talk to you next week. And they're like, no. It's $400 if you could have coverage to us by high noon tomorrow. And this was coming in at like 4:00. I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I've got a fax machine. I can make anything happen. Honestly, it was a blast reading it really under a crunch timeline like that. I still love that book. My recommend was 300% remake it. Like, there's a whole subversive Mark Twain element that was never translated to the screen. And of course, all that lost sleep, getting it in on time, the coverage and everything. Yeah, nothing ever happened. Like, it was typical, just reader hell.
This is the transitive property of Michael Levy, if you remember that.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay. That's fascinating to know. Well, all right, Craig, just to encapsulate, and I know this would be its own episode because I want to get to Final Destination Bloodlines. What would you say was your biggest lesson of making the first Final Destination movie? Because it really was different for you, and it led to this whole franchise of so many movies, and it was kind of unlike what you had produced before. What was your biggest lesson as a producer?
Well, there's two things. One, don't call a movie Final Destination and think they're going to be sequels. It's probably a bad idea. But the second thing is that these movies are very, very technically challenging to make, not just in terms of orchestrating special effects and visual effects and stunts and all of those various disciplines that have to be working on their A game every day because they all intersect, but that the tone of these movies is really hard to pull off because on the one hand, you have characters that you're supposed to be empathetic and like, but they're going to be dying. And you need to have the other characters mourn those deaths or they're monsters, but not so much mourning that it becomes really moribund and sad and takes away from the need to drive the story forward. So there's a lot of plates that the writers have to spin to keep all of these elements in concert in a way that feels fresh, original, and plausible without making the movie completely collapse into either being cheesy or being over the top or being corny or not being human. If there's anything I learned is that is the biggest challenge and the best alchemy that you can achieve with the franchise is the marrying of all these seemingly disparate elements into one cohesive tone, which I think we can arguably say we succeeded very well with Final Destination Bloodlines.
Getting to this movie, I guess the question would be, I can't remember how long the gap is between the last Final Destination movie and this. Is it
14 years of production and 15 years to release?
Yeah, because it was 09, right?
It was 2011, so 14 years.
And so I'm sure it was a lot of false starts between then and now. When you finally had the Zoom that Lori and Guy were in to kind of pitch ideas,
that was
how many
phase
times
2.
Before that?
Sheila and I have been working to try and get it off the ground for many, many years after the release of Final Destination 5, which I thought was creatively one of the more successful entries, but it ultimately was not as successful as Final Destination 4 or The Final Destination, which was like riding that cresting 3D wave economically. The studio said, let's just ease off a little bit. Like normally there was a 3-year gap between making the movies. They had a 2-year gap. So it was really crunched together. I'm still very happy with how FD5 turned out, but it was a very, very challenging timeline. But around 2017 or 18, Sheila, they were like, yeah, we've got this thing called Max coming up, and we should probably look into feeding the IP into that. So let's give it another go round. So we opened up the floor to a bunch of writers, wound up hearing pitches from 6 verbally only. And then from those 6, we picked 3 to present to the studio to develop a little bit further and take in. Dunstan and Melton got the job to do it. They did all the Saw movies, the Collector franchise. And so they understood how to sort of service franchises, and they seemed to have the right energy and attitude. And they did a great job for the most part. The third act was a little hard to sort of stick the landing on. But at that point, there was a lot of regime change going on over at Warner Brothers. COVID was in the throes of, we were just leaning into getting towards where that was happening. There was, again, a lot of studio upheaval. At the end of the day, it just wasn't quite ready to be primetime. So we were trying to find a way to reinvigorate it. And in the process, I had a phone call with a manager asking about a piece of talent, saying, hey, would they be interested in having a conversation? We know they're sort of super nerds. We'd love to have a super nerd come in. And the manager goes, that person's not available. They're really booked tight. But I know someone who's one of the biggest fans of the franchise. In fact, he says he learned all about filmmaking from watching all the DVDs. Like, this is huge. He loves this thing. And it's my husband, John Watts. So that was Diane. And John had a great idea. And that's literally how he came into it. He had no idea that we were looking for somebody who might have a sort of different take on it. And he did. And it was. And here we are.
The Dunstan and Melton version, which was really like 2018, 2019 into 2020, is a completely different movie.
Completely different.
And part of it, which has been online a lot, so people probably won't be surprised to hear, it all centered around first responders as the group. Because one of
police, EMT, ambulance driver.
To Craig's list of the things we learned, in addition to it being tonally really challenging, the other thing we learned in this franchise is everyone thinks the kills are the hard part. And honestly, I think that's the easier part. The hard part is justifying a group of people that can be together and figure out this crazy thing that's happening to them and build a group that we want to watch for 90 minutes. It's a very tricky thing to get that energy in that group together. So this was a group of first responders originally. And in that regard, we were, tugging along, and like Craig said, the third act, wasn't where it needed to be. There was some regime changes, but also when COVID hit, there was no way we were going to make a horror movie with first responders dying. Like, it just was never going to happen. So it was a place to sort of shelve that for a minute and let it breathe. And then we have this John Watts revelation. So the universe was telling us we needed to get this thing made. It just wasn't going to be that version. So then we have the room with the MVP horror writers, and the dream team emerges.
And so you guys came in, and so Craig, I'm guessing John Watts decided not to do a script because he was busy on other stuff, and that's why Lori and Guy came in, or did he do a script?
He just wrote this sort of outline/treatment that sort of gave the broad strokes of set pieces and sort of what the twist would be, the idea that would center on a family, and a couple of thematic things he thought would be important. Yeah, he had a lot on his plate. He was finishing a certain movie with somebody, Spider something. I can't remember his name. Yeah. He was dealing with that. He was looking to have somebody else come in and write, and he just came on board along with Diane to produce with us to make sure that his vision sort of came to the screen, and it did.
Lori and Guy, what could you tell us about that first pitch meeting? I mean, we'll get into finer details in the spoilers, but did you organize in a way with, a long outline or pitch decks or stuff like that? And as you said, this was going on, it sounds like during lockdowns possibly. So everybody was doing this on Zoom, which was also new at the time, and now it's just regular. So tell us what you remember about that first meeting.
Like Guy said earlier, we were brought in, there were probably about 8 or 9 different writers coming in. We were all given this treatment that John Watts had put together, talking about the idea of the family. And so we were using that as a jumping off point. We would talk about the potential of the family and the fun you can have there with that. We were talking about opening set pieces. One of the main ones was, at the time, it was a riverboat. That was one of the things that we were playing with. And then we just talked a lot about deaths and ways to execute the idea. And it was just a lot of riffing. Guy, if you want to jump in too.
Like, you do some prep just because you want to, earn your daily pay or whatever fee they're offering you for the 5 hours of your time. And so, you come prepared, but it's really just like, hey, let's riff and let's pitch into, like building on that pitch. How about this? And a lot of it is, because it was a family, there was this really fun new element to it. We were all fans, I think, of the franchise. At least I know Lori and I were. And so we're like, oh, this is such a cool angle to reinvigorate this. And then it's like, okay, so what are the twists you could do? Like, and, the big thing is like in these movies is what's the order of the deaths and like, how can you use the family in that and that kind of thing. So you're just having fun. You're also trying to impress because these roundtables are all secret auditions. And so you're always trying to, like give your best, put in your A game because you kind of secretly hoping like, well, if I do really well today, if I get some points on the board, if I look like I get the franchise, maybe I'll get a call. And so you take it as what it is, but you're also like, I personally really love this franchise and I wanted to come and be like, I could keep playing in here. And then Lori and I both after that day got a call. And we both kind of talked about it and we realized that we were so busy that we didn't have time. And it was like, oh man, like I've always wanted to do a Final Destination movie. I know Lori had too. Like, what if we team up and we kind of split the burden? And so we decided to kind of form a team. And that's when we came up with our actual pitch. And I still don't know how many other people were pitching, but I know that Lori and I pretty quickly after that roundtable, came up with like, here's what we would do with what John started with and what we liked about that roundtable. And some new ideas too, and just kind of quickly put it into a movie shaped form-ish. And we're like, here it is. And I think we pitched you two and John, Diane, and New Line, I think Newstatter and maybe Chris. But yeah, it was kind of it was a big group and those are always nerve-wracking, but we felt pretty confident in what we had and we were lucky enough to get another really nice call.
Sheila and Craig, for a second, just because you're here, it's a great opportunity to really explain to writers how some of these pitch fests work of like a group dynamic, because obviously you are the owners of the intellectual property. So people are coming in to pitch on your property. And I guess the awkwardness is if somebody has a good idea, but you don't end up hiring them, you've still invited them in on a formal pitch, which there is a fee on, or is there not? Because I know that was part of what the strike was about. So
Sheila, you take this one because you do the pitch fests all the time by academics.
So to rewind, we actually don't own the intellectual property. When a studio buys a screenplay, they then roll the copyright. So we like to think of ourselves as the curator and the steward of the franchise. I mean, some people have referred to us as sort of showrunner-esque in that we sort of are keeping our eyes on the prize and keep the tone, keep the voice, no matter who's coming and going, getting these things made. But the way these work is there's a really terrific arrangement with the Writers Guild where writers would come into one of these rooms, and it's whether it's a feature or a TV show, they're sort of run similarly. They write out a deal memo, the writers all get a day rate, and everything generated in the room that day is owned by the studio.
Exactly. Okay, so great.
Everybody's sharing all their ideas, and it's all kosher. But what was interesting about this one, I think people are always caught off guard, at least from when I explain it, is to be pitching on a movie where there is no script at all, versus usually you come in to pitch a rewrite plan. So the fact that all these writers were having this amazing spitball day, and I remember a lot of riffing on like family lore, like family stories. I had a crazy aunt, I had a weird grandma, like that helped curate where we would kill people and all that good stuff. But to then have, Guy and Lori go home and basically everybody got sort of the Sparks notes or the cliff notes of what went down that day so that they could all go home and come up with a pitch to come back and to what Guy said, bring forward what they loved about that day or what spoke to them about that day, plus what John Watts had built as a foundation. That is where we step in, and then we start listening to how everybody sort of assimilated all of that information. And it was so clear that they both were bringing equal but different parts to the equation, that to pair them up was the strongest version. Again, my son, when I was explaining to him, he's like, it's the dream team. So, so it made perfect sense to us. I don't know, Craig, is there anything you want to fill in? But that was sort of our... Well,
since we'd already worked with Lori, we were like, we want to have Lori come in, but we were also big fans of Guy, even though we had never met him before. So both of their respective ideas ideas, and we were torn because we're like, God, we really like both of them. And I remember, Laurie, we called you, we're like, we really love you, but like they really like Guy too. And you were like, well, I know Guy. Well, let me talk to Guy. And then we're like, what do you mean? Maybe we'll do it together. I was like, are you fucking kidding me? This is great. Perfect. And you guys had that conversation because that was a bonus we never imagined was possible given these rooms. It's usually either if they're not an established writing team, they're all there fighting for their own piece of the pie. But we were able to add peanut butter and chocolate for the first time in my career and get something 10 times better than what it was originally. So we really lucked out. I think we really, really lucked out.
I can't remember how it went down, but I think I was just talking with my wife, Amanda, going, I wonder if we could just do it together. Do you think I should ask Laurie? And I got a text like that moment. It was like, hey, can we talk?
Everybody knew.
It was
something like that. It was something like that.
Yeah, we were both in the same dilemma because we both love Final Destination. And Guy was working on some like Scream and Ready or Not 2. And like he was on these great projects, but he loved Final Destination. I love Final Destination, but there was a good chance I was going to be able to go direct Bed Rest later in the year. And so I was in this dilemma of like, well, I really love to go for this, but if I end up getting it and then I have to go away for 2 months, I would feel awful about that. And so as I'm going through this dilemma, Guy's going through his dilemma, and it just organically kind of came out that, yeah, Guy was talking to his wife and then we started texting. And so the rest is history. And luckily they were down to do this with us because that's the one thing we're thinking, like, would they be okay with this for us teaming up together? And
the studio was thrilled because they really liked both of you guys and we're kind of at an impasse. Like, well, what do we do? You guys eliminated the Sophie's Choice by coming to us and saying we'll work together. It was great.
But does that create a problem with your agents? Because obviously your agents want to each get you whatever your going rate is. So were they able to just combine that into a number that you guys would split? Was that as easy as it was to form a writing team?
Pretty much. In the aggregate, the benefits far outweigh any deficit. It's because this is a huge IP. It's so iconic. It's such a great opportunity. It's kind of like however you can get it is okay with your team. And, they knew Laurie and her work. And so there was no concern about about the quality. It was just like, yeah, this makes sense. Like you guys have limited time, make a tag team and go and get, go and do it together. Idea. So yeah.
And Guy looks great in the unitard, by the way. Guy looks fantastic in the unitard for the tag team. It's fantastic.
On the ropes. That was the second wrestling reference I've made today. So maybe I just
there you go.
WWE on the mind.
Well, I guess Sheila and Craig, before we get into the spoiler section, two questions for you. What do you want writers to know about these kind of pitch meetings and writers that come into pitch even for rewrites? What are the things that you're looking for that are important that writers might not realize? Like they know the proper things about study up on the IP if there is one, or read the script that you'll be rewriting and really take meticulous notes. But what else could you tell us?
I mean, I get really excited honestly when two things. It sounds crazy and it's anti-early writer planning, but I'm all about someone taking a big swing. I just feel like if you've got to
I was going to say, be bold.
Yeah, if
be bold.
Get a movie made and you're going to be in the trenches and we're asking a studio to spend a tremendous amount of money, not only to make it, but to market it, all sorts of manpower. We've got to literally get 250 people to be on this plan. Come in and swing big because you're going to help us fight that fight. And I'm good with that. Even if it's not quite right, we can get you there. We're good with that part. We just want somebody who's bold, I would say.
You need to give us the ammunition to convince other people that your path is the right path. And so if it's bold and it's unique and it's fresh, we can fight the fight. It makes us easier. I'm going from as opposed to a letter opener, we've got a broadsword to go in that fight if you're really right.
And then the other thing that Craig and I have a lot of conversations later, and I know sometimes it's hard when you know that we made Final Destination because people don't think of characters as the first thing when we talk about this franchise. But honestly, when we are reading any script or listening to any pitches, we need to know there's a character we are going to climb on board and go on a ride with. And so many times in pitch form, people aren't coming in with a really well thought out character because it's like in their brain, they're like, I need to pitch really quick and really efficiently. And I got to get to the juicy parts and get to the hook and get to the poster. But I just need 4 sentences on why this person is somebody worth going on the ride with. And a lot of times they trip on that, I would argue.
Can I piggyback on that just as from the writer's point of view? Because just in my experience, and Laurie, I don't know about yours, but I'm guessing it's probably similar. The pitches where you do the big swings are the ones where you get the job. because if you go in and go, I'm confident in this because it's the movie I would want to see, if you really love it, that comes through. And if you're just trying to check boxes for the producers or the studio or whoever you're pitching, that comes through. And even if you really care about it, it starts to feel rote and just kind of like, yes, then I would do this set piece. And then I have to completely agree with Sheila on character. Like, that's so important. I mean, that's the story is character, and that's where the emotion comes from. And that's what makes a story great, is if you can connect to them and feel something for them. But yeah, I love that you said that, because that was something that took me a while to learn as a writer pitching, was like, you got to go in and just do the version you'd want to see 100%, even if it's crazy. Yeah. And then I can if I don't get that job, I can walk away feeling okay. Because I'm like, I did 100% what I would want to see. And if they don't want to do that, that's okay. But if you go in and half-ass it and try to do what they want and you don't get it, you're like, oh, I didn't even pitch what I wanted.
Guy, your job isn't to get the job. Your job is to be able to walk to your car after the meeting proud of yourself. That's all you can control. Just do that, and you'll have a better chance than anything of getting the job itself.
But every executive I've ever talked to Craig's point, you can be walking to your car feeling confident, and that executive similarly can have the confidence to go take the risk and fight, right? So it's all about giving everybody the ammunition to be willing to take the risk.
Well, in the easiest terms, I think it all comes back to John Watts' concept of making it in a family, hence the title Bloodlines. This isn't really a spoiler. It's the title of the movie. And if anyone has seen the trailer, we know that it's taking place in one family. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basis of it. And that's an easy idea, but it's a big idea, and it's different from all the previous films that have come before it. So I think that's why this thing was greenlit and made it through the rigmarole of the process. I guess, Craig and Sheila, before we get to the spoilers, like a last question for you is, what was the budget and the schedule? And then how did the strike impact things? Because I'm sure that happened somewhere along the way.
Oh my God. Before this, we discussed, I was like, do you think we're going to talk about budget? Like, we had this whole conversation before we logged in.
It's always out there reported one way or another on Wikipedia. It's either accurate or inaccurate. So here's Craig, your chance to give a range.
It's all Craig, and remember the strike.
All I will say is this. Yes, the writer's strike significantly impacted us in this respect. We were prepping off of a draft that was handed in the day before the strike was an issue. And we were to the point where we had actors doing rehearsals, and they're kind of making stuff up, and we're making notes about what might work, because they're going to improv the whole movie, because we couldn't have any dialogue changes. So they were just sort of like, make sure they hit this and trying to remember what they said here, and we'll try and coach them on the day. And during the tech scout, the poor directors were literally pantomiming what was going to happen, because we couldn't publish a script with any of the things that they were in their head trying to evolve. It was the greatest thing that ever happened. And Lori and Guy will probably say yes, indeed, was the actor strike. It was the greatest thing that could have happened for this movie, because all the things that we learned during the prep of the movie, we were not able to implement into a page so that everyone could work off of sing from the same hymnal. Once that happened, these guys were able to download everything we learned in the process and the things that did or didn't work, both technically and financially and otherwise, and they were able to sort of turn around a draft that reflected all that information. We would not be having this conversation, I think, had there not been an actor strike. It would not have gone any way in the way that it did. But because of the sort of new parsimonious nature of the world right now, we had 45 days to shoot this, and the shortest previous schedule was 60 days. It was a very all hands on deck, let's make this work. All of the money that was spent on the prep for what we called season 1 was sort of money that we couldn't, it was just gone, but it had to be absorbed into the overall cost. So I'm not going to go into the ultimate cost of the movie, but let's just say that if you take away the push costs that we had to absorb, plus the prep costs that didn't actually wind up manifesting on screen, we made the movie for about the same amount of money as FD5. The added stuff is just the accounting stuff that you have to manage when you're dealing with accounting. So
look, the strikes were a necessary function of this industry continuing. I mean, the fall before the WGA strike, I think the WGA successfully sued Netflix for $70+ million in unpaid residuals. So, I mean, there was tomfoolery going around that needed to be corrected, and it was. It certainly
Sheila's Irish. It's shenanigans, not tomfoolery.
There you go.
We could do tomfoolery as well.
There you go.
All right.
Well, but at the end of the day, what I've learned in the last few years, talking to everybody that's made it to the other side of the strike and their production got to become revived, was there was that draft in which it was a new draft for a new world post-strike, new budget. And tell us, Lori and Guy, how long did you have for that draft. Then we're going to get into the spoilers because it's impossible to really track the things that were going on. And I want to hear about the steamboat that never even made it into the movie, damn it. So just how long did you have functionally for that draft?
There was about a month to get to that locked draft.
Okay.
And Sheila just said there was an Excel spreadsheet of all the things that we were learning that was sent over and like, here's what we learned and figure out how to work.
This is what props told us. This is what stunts told us. So that like hopefully gave a little bit of a template. But it was, as Lori said, it was definitely only like a month because the studio wanted to make sure we were keeping everything moving along.
And going back before that, Lori and Guy, just about your creative habit for a second, because Craig definitely pointed out he wants folks to know about your writing habit. You know, how important was outlining to your process when you were working together as a team? I know you both come from television, which is highly outlined. And then also on your daily habit, what do you find more important, writing to a page count or a certain number of hours a day? No stress on you, Lori. Tell us about your writing habit and your collaboration with Guy.
We had a basic idea of how we wanted to attack the script when he and I first jumped on. How it worked out, the studio wanted to see act by act. Sometimes you get the benefit and you can actually just write the whole script and turn it in, but we were working act by act. So at the time when we originally started out, what we took a pass each. So I started and I wrote the first act and then I gave it to Guy and he did a pass. And then we kind of ping-ponged like that for a little bit. And then eventually I would say that we started to gravitate towards certain scenes or sequences that we both liked. And so we would each take, I would say, run point on that. So as far as like hitting a page count per day, it was more of, okay, we needed to turn in a certain act by a certain time. So we all just worked backwards and gave it enough time so I could do the pass, he could do a pass, and we can kind of go back and forth and get it to a place where we would turn it in.
I think, I mean, in the beginning, we had in-person conversations for quite a bit. I'd go to her house or vice versa, and we would just go through and be like, what do we love about this thing? What are the things that are special to us? First thing you want to do, which John had already done so beautifully, but we needed to do as well, is identify what's the DNA of this franchise? Like, what are the absolutes that you must include for this to be a Final Destination movie? And then how do you make it the same but different so it's exciting? And then, you know, in all of the Final Destination movies, it's about changing the lore, changing the rules, but also making them still make sense with movies that have come before. John, again, had done a lot of the work for us. And so we were able to jump in, but we still had to be like, okay, so then what are the twists on that? Once we set up what the order is supposed to be of the deaths, how do we subvert it? When do we subvert? All that kind of stuff. So those were the fun conversations. That's when it's kind of, it's not blue sky, but we're just like really getting our hands dirty. It's like, how do we make this our own? How do we make this really fun? And then, yeah, it just became kind of all right, we have a deadline. Now that everyone's on this, we probably turned in an outline or two, probably had a few Zooms with the powers that be. Everyone was on the same page. Okay, go to script. And then, like Lori said, it was like, we wanted to see it act by act. So you got to get act one in by this date. And so it was, you know, like Lori said, she'd do a pass, I'd do a pass, she'd do another pass. We'd just polish each other until we felt okay with it, turn it in. We'd already be started on the second act. You know, I think the way we did it, Lori, was like you started one of the acts and I started one of the, I don't even remember which was which, just so we could get ahead of it. Because I know you had like prep, you were getting ready to go shoot. And so we're like, how do we maximize Lori's time? And then when do I kind of take over for a couple months? And then I got to go do, I think it was Scream 6 at the time. And then when are you going to take over and carry the lion's share? But yeah, that's how I generally work with partners, is just like, we split up scenes. It's, you take, you know, this sequence of scenes 1, 2, 3, I'll take 4, 5, 6, we swap. And then eventually you rewrite each other enough that it feels like one voice, you know, one writer.
You know, just for the whole group, it is a strange beast. I mean, Craig compared it earlier to like, you know, season 1 of the show and stuff like that. But when you're turning in an act at a time to the studio, it is like you're writing a 3-episode TV show in which it's act 1, act 2, and act 3. I've heard different things from writers about whether it's destructive or whether it can benefit the project. I feel like most writers, when they're able to write their own script completely, acts 1, 2, and 3, they're then able to go back to those previous acts and rethread things as needed. Whereas when you're turning in things an act at a time, it's like a serialized short story in a way. Tell me, Craig, I see you want to say, but like, is it a good thing? Because I can't decide.
It is a very specifically New Line thing. They like 15 to 20 page chunks going forward for every movie. They really like to get a sense of how things are going, not because they necessarily going to jump in every time and micromanage every syllable, but they want to start to understand understand sort of the global, what is this movie going to be? And quite frankly, it's Sheila and my job to both manage them as well as help Guy and Laurie, who are probably feeling, oh my God, we have a deadline. Don't worry about this, like every beat of this set piece. Right now, they just want to know where it takes place, what's going to happen. We can figure out later when we sort of better workshop it on the ground, but let's just keep the train moving forward. So it becomes a juggling act of both politics and process. But New Line, at least I don't want to speak for those guys, but from my experience working with them, they are hands-on while being hands-off. They want to know, but they do not get into the super nitty-gritty unless they are trying to keep us from going down a place that they know is not going to help us in the long run. Our executive's job is to get the movie made, and that seems to be our goal too. So we just have to make sure that we all work for that goal and give them the tools they need to push it through the system, because that's a whole other dynamic that we are not privy to.
I mean, I guess I would say that this is endemic of it being an assignment in which they were hiring writers for a very specific assignment. So of course they could do it an act at a time.
And under deadline. They want to get this movie made. So,
but if it was a spec, you would never be turning in a spec like that. Like, you would just give the whole script and then you could analyze the whole script. I still think the whole script is always the best way to go, but obviously I quite enjoyed your movie, so you guys pulled through this with no problem whatsoever, and thus we are going to get into the spoilers, darn it. Podcast listeners in Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could watch these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could watch all of us Brady Bunch style on a Zoomcast. If you have not yet seen Final Destination Bloodlines, it's in theaters only. Go see it, press pause right now, and then come back and listen to the rest of the episode.
See it twice.
See it twice. Yeah, do your homework, because we are going to get into the spoilers. Okay, so right off the bat, John Watts' idea is genius, because not only is it taking place in a family, but the concept of the movie culminates in a great exposition scene that was very entertaining, in which literally a bloodline of all the families involved in the inciting incident are put up on a wall to see who's lived, who's made it, who's died. Just an absolutely great concept. But before we get there, I just want to hear, what was the steamboat? Because I love hearing discarded ideas, and it's always fun to hear about something that was never shot, not even a deleted scene. So tell us, was there a steamboat you're saying that was going to start the movie? Is that what it was?
It was a riverboat, with the giant paddle, and it was like a secret gambling den. This is back in the 60s. And I think the reason John had chosen it initially was just because we hadn't seen a boat before. We'd done a plane crash. We'd done the car crashes in two, roller coaster, suspension bridge, NASCAR. We hadn't done a boat. There was nothing on water. And so it made sense. And then I think through, various people, like there was a version scripted of that, several versions, I think, several revisions of it. Something I'm proud of. It was a good sequence. Like we were able to weaponize a lot of the things on the boat in very fun and gruesome ways. But I think it might have even been Zadam coming in and going, what is bumping us about this is that being on a riverboat isn't a universal experience. We've all been at spectator sports. We've all been on a bridge. We've all been in traffic. We've all been on a plane. This isn't something a lot of people have done. And so then it shifted, and spoilers are okay now. So it shifted to heights. It shifted to how can we ruin tall places, high places for people in a way, and then still differentiate it from a bridge, which was in 5. And I think that was the challenge initially, was getting everyone on board to say, no, heights hasn't really been done. That was more about destruction and stuff like that. And eventually everyone got very excited. And I'm really glad, because Laurie and I think from the get-go, when we were thinking of alts, heights and tall buildings was our preferred thing to try.
And I would add on to that by saying it's heights plus the fact that it's hard to get out when you're up there.
Yes.
And it's not like there's floors going down. There's one way in and one way out. You can't go anywhere as shit's going down. So the height part of it is always and you're always going to encounter that with every means by trying to escape. So it's additive.
Yeah, I agree. So the riverboat was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to work on. But what I love about the opening premonitions, it's always something you look at and go, oh shit, I know what the feeling is. I know what the fear is. That's why the plane works so well. The roller coaster works so well. And with the boat, yes, there's the fear of drowning or being on there, but something like heights, you know exactly what that fear is, and being trapped up someplace high. And so I'm glad we made the shift. And that's the fun of the Final Destination movies, is that first premonition is always that thing you go, oh yeah, I get the fear. Whereas the rest of the movie is finding things that usually don't think are dangerous that end up coming back to kill you. As Adam would say, like, what are those things that we can ruin? What are those everyday items, like whether it's a paperclip or whatever, that you can weaponize? That's fun.
Just for our listeners, when they say Zadam, they mean Zach and Adam, the co-directors.
I have something fun that I just want to read a couple of things, and these are the actual notes from that writer's room so many years ago.
Please, let's
where
hear.
we talked just about the randomness of the set pieces. And again, some of these are never going to make it. It was just the spitballing process. So set pieces. Are you ready? Kids play place, playground like Chuck E. Cheese. Well, weirdly, that did wind up in the movie, but it just not in the script, but didn't wind up in the movie. A sperm donation center. A kid who gets stuck in the trunk of an SUV and died, and how like the seats fold over and stuff. A second grade classroom. An REI or sports store. A bar that has axe throwing. Deep fryers, either on the roadside or in any kind of a retail establishment. A club scene with sparklers, alcohol, blowing fire, stilettos. We did a supermarket. We did a supermarket sequence that we wrote, and it just didn't, it felt like it was very flop sweaty. Gas station and mini mart combined, there was a version of that was written for Final Destination Bloodlines and prepped to a point, and locations were scouted, but it was so expensive.
What was so expensive about a gas station mini mart? You would think that's not expensive.
It exploded.
Right.
It exploded. There was a car on it. It had to be on a hill. The RV goes rolling down. They have to figure out how to stop it. One person's outside, one person's inside. There's all kinds of stuff happening both by the gas tanks as well as inside the mini mart for product and cast and extras and logistics and having to actually build a gas station. You're going to have to explode because you can't really explode a gas station. It just became, for what it was intended to do narratively, it started getting ahead of its skis in terms of cost. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze, as they say.
The idea was that this is the first time the family is actually working together, and they were going there to get information about JB, to find out where he was, and that all the family is working together to save Bobby. But ultimately, it just works. They're just going together in this RV to the hospital, and that's all you need, that they're actually finally working together as a family. You don't need the big set piece. It was fun to write.
And communicating.
It was fun to write.
And communicating as a family. That's where we learn about Darlene, why she left. Like, if it was just an action set piece, we wouldn't have the pause to allow those moments to breathe.
That makes sense. I guess what was interesting right off the get-go is that, it is the premonition dream that we're used to. Usually we see someone trying to avoid that incident, but here it's generational, in which it's Steph having a dream about her grandmother Iris's experience. So it's already kind of complicating itself on a very interesting level. When did that idea come into the plot of the film?
That was all John, and that was the big hook. That's why I was so excited to be part of that roundtable initially. I was like, this is cool. We haven't seen it before. And the other big change, which was even debated, I think, throughout the process, but it was, these movies always have a group of, 6, 7 characters that survive because of the one character's premonition. This was hundreds. And it was like, that's cool too. That blows this up in a way that I am so excited about as a fan. Like, I want to see that. And now death has reclaimed hundreds of souls, not just the people that were supposed to die that day, but their offspring and their grandchildren. And this is the only family left because Iris outsmarted death. That was all John. And it was so cool and very smart. It got us all excited.
Everything had been a smaller group of people before. And to see how death is tracking people for decades, I think that's a really interesting view of death and just how relentless he is and petty and will do anything to finish the job, even if it takes decades.
There was the annoying little kid with the penny on the observation deck. And in one version, we definitely see him get his comeuppance and die. But I was actually curious if there was ever any plans for him to wind up as an adult somewhere else and see him years later get it.
I don't know if there's a plan, but he could have.
He did.
Where's their version? Oh, yeah, I think there was.
Remember, we did there was a sequence where we did like 6 cut-throughs through the decades.
Oh, yeah, we were seeing
all these
people
like, dying. Yeah, and the penny kid was somebody who died.
Is like the elevator operator, the penny kid.
There was the lady that burned her with a cigarette. She dies in flames at some point. There was someone that ended up like noosed in an elevator. Yeah. There was some fun stuff.
Their deaths were anagrams for how they died in the actual Skyview.
Exactly.
Right. It mirrored sort of that. And then honestly, this is like a great example of sort of distilling down a cool idea because production ultimately couldn't. It was overwhelmed by all those eras and cutting through and doing montages, which are very expensive for writers to.
Yeah.
No one ever realizes that. What we ended up doing is the scene you just mentioned, Jeff, earlier, which is when our lead, Stephanie, is explaining to the family that this has gone on for decades, and she lays out this entire sort of, we call it the murder wall on the, above the fireplace. All of those are actual, like if you were able to freeze frame and zoom in, all of those are real newspaper articles generated by our art department. And we have the Penny Kid, he's a purse snatcher, got hit by a piano moving truck. So we 100% tie it together. So we took what was like a huge montage and turned it into a newspaper article.
I guess on a writing level, and then obviously distill it producing as well, screenwriters are often sometimes told, unless you're directing it, don't tell us every little thing that happens. We don't need to know A plus B plus C. Like, we get it. We know how somebody walks across the room, little things. But in these movies, every single little detail needs to be spelled out. So Lori and Guy, just for you, for starters, what was it like to have to deal with that detail on the page, whereas at the same time, you don't want to bore the reader? I mean, obviously, the details you're writing are not minutia. They're exciting parts of a, larger death trap that is unfolding before us. But I could see, writers battle a lot of exposition, and I could see that being a skill for art as well, in which you don't want to alienate your reader, but you have to convey what is happening, as complicated as it is.
Absolutely. So I think as a writer, when you're writing, you want to make it fun. You want to make it pop off the page. But as we were working on this more and more, especially when it comes to these kill sequences, specificity is so important for everybody, for every little visual, for everyone who's working on the movie to know what they need to be working on. I found that I had to kind of let that go and just make sure everything is very clear and everything is really tracking, because just the way things work together, it's like juggling, right? It's like everything fits together so perfectly. So that's something I definitely had to sort of put ego aside and just really focus a lot of times on those kills with just the specificity.
Doesn't that also make for a really long production draft, which is okay? I mean, like, as it should be, because the team gets it, but does it?
It's probably a little wordier, but I wouldn't say it was, I think there's a way you can kind of do it, get the level of detail in there that you need, but still be kind of pithy with it. And it's like those Rube Goldberg's the deaths, though, those are the real challenges, because it's like, okay. And then, like Lori said, you have to be so detailed because everyone, so many departments need to know exactly what's going to happen. So you have to be super detailed. And we kind of, I think for at least a couple, we had to work backwards, where it's like, okay, this is where the character ends up. So then what's in the room? What can we use? And then it's just a puzzle. And it would take us, several passes, I think, on a lot of these. Like, I do one and give it to Lori, vice versa. We'd both be working on them. And then it's like, oh, what about this instead? And then sometimes you get a note where it's like, we got to cut that for budget or creative. We don't like it. Start over. And like, okay, so how do we end up at the same place where this character dies, but in a different way? And it's a different location. It's not in this building anymore. It's a backyard barbecue, so you kind of have to stay on your toes. But I don't think it ended up being too big of a length problem for the script, but I think there were a lot of rewrites, and in terms of like, now let's get more specific. Now that we know what the location is specifically, How do we just tailor it? Like you were saying earlier, Jeff, like that relationship between the environment and the writers, like that's so important, so we can get in and know what we're actually dealing with. Then you can really get into the nitty gritty.
Let me interject for a second. Morgan and Wong, who did 1 and 3, obviously were writer-directors. I think each of those scripts was 130 pages long, because like the old scripts, A.J.L. Diamond and Billy Wilder, they called every shot. They actually had a character turn the element that was specific to the thing. It was very easy to read, and you understood what was happening, but it was very long. So it was like, the studio's like, how can we make this movie for this much money? It's so big. It's like, it's not. Like, if you condense it down. A guy, you mentioned the idea of, what was once at one place became a backyard barbecue. Howard used to have like a Dave and Buster's kind of funhouse where he had arcade games and a bowling and all kinds of things. He wanted to have his family have the kind of experience of fun that he never had growing up. So that was really what he did. So we had, like, imagine going into Dave and Buster's and the whole place is designed to kill you. And they wrote the scene. We found a location, and yet like a lot of times happens, we got in there and we're like, okay, it's really big. And then, okay, well, half of the fun of Final Destination is that there's proximity. You can get a sense of the geography. But if it's so sprawling and big and the elements are spread out, it doesn't have the same sense of foreboding because you have to remember where things are in relation to where our characters are. So when we start blocking it toward one section, we're like, why the hell are we paying for all of this when it's right here? And even then we're having some flop sweat to get it to work because this felt forced. The idea of doing it in the backyard, everyone has backyards. Let's destroy 4th of July. If that's our overarching principle, how do we destroy an everyday common event? We all have to have dinner with family in the backyard sometimes. Let's take that one out. And
well, so was that part of your rewrite post-strike? Because you had scouted that location pre-strike?
Yes, perfect example. And we had prepped an entire version and knew by the time we were sent home because of the actor strike, we knew like that thing is never
that doesn't work.
Yeah. Come back. And by the way, just to reassure Guy, you're not wrong. I just looked up what was the buff production draft. So that's, 6 drafts into production, pretty much almost the final shooting script, and it's 109 pages.
Oh, wow. So, that's lean. Wow.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah. So there you go.
I think the barbecue is something that perfectly encapsulates tone, which is really tough to manage, in which this is a horror comedy. And if it's too terrifying, it suddenly is no longer funny, and people get a little confused as to be laughing or be horrified. In the barbecue, you have that piece of glass that falls into the ice, which is a fear that everyone who's seen the movie will have. It's interesting because really that piece of glass then falls on the ground and is used in a different way. You repurpose it in which somebody steps on it. So you already have this horrifying concept, but just like death is playing with the people, you as writers are playing with the audience's expectations. Tell us about that tone of managing the comedy and the horror elements together, because there is a fine art to it.
Well, you touch on a couple of things, the tone and then also being ahead of the audience. So in terms of the tone, and Craig talked about this earlier, I think that's one of the hardest things to get in these movies because they are played dramatically, but on the other hand, there's humor and you have these wildly elaborate deaths. So if you push it too far in the comedy or with the death, it starts to feel a little bit campy. And then if you play it too dramatically, it starts to take itself too seriously. So we're always going back and rejiggering and just making sure we're not leaning too far in each direction, that it's fun, it's poppy, but it also does take itself seriously. Not too seriously, though. And then it also, on top of that, because with this movie, we're dealing with a family, that's even more challenging because there are these built-in relationships with this family. And so when somebody dies, it's pretty weighty. And so that's one of the things Guy and I also had to really manage was acknowledging these deaths and giving it the weight and the gravity, but also keeping the levity as well. I found that to be one of the biggest challenges in writing it because you don't want it to be depressing. When a character's parent or sibling or a cousin dies, that's really serious. It's different in FD2 when they're all strangers. And yeah, it sucks when somebody dies, but oh my gosh, now death is coming for me. Now, in this version, they're banding together. And the one thing that really helped us in that respect was the urgency of we have to figure this out. We all have to work together. And to talk about how things are used, like you talked about the glass shard, that was also a big challenge, is staying ahead of the audience because modern audiences are incredibly savvy. And luckily, we have this great brain trust that Guy and I worked with Craig and Sheila and Zach and Adam and John, the guys at New Line. So as we are crafting these kill sequences, it was this sort of great sort of like we talk about the riffing. We would all sit there and look at it and somebody would go, oh, and wait, we can do this. Oh, and then that sparks somebody else saying, oh, we can do this. And just everybody working together to really ratchet up the tension and to milk each sequence and to make sure we have enough red herrings so that it doesn't feel predictable, because that's the danger there with audiences.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in to remind you to check out today's sponsor and remind you that the regular deadline for Final Draft's Big Break Screenwriting Contest is June 9th, 2025. You could enter now for the possibility to share in over $80,000 in cash and prizes. Previous winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold and optioned screenplays, and been staffed in TV writers' rooms. All you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more about the Big Break Screenwriting Contest at finaldraft.com. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. It's our 13th year of publishing, and heck, it's my 20th year of podcasting, and I couldn't have done either of those things without you. If you've never read us before, you could test drive us by reading a free issue at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop, or via the Backstory app on iPads worldwide. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these conversations as Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see us chatting it up. It would really mean a lot to me to have you show your support for independent entertainment journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now let's jump right back into our conversation with producers Craig Perry and Sheila Hanahan Taylor, along with co-writers Guy Busick and Lori Evans Taylor, about their latest film, Final Destination Bloodlines, which you could see in theaters right now. I mean, some of the comedy that was really funny was just the family drama that you were able to get about one of the kids being outside the family coming from an affair. And I thought that was a really funny idea, because then you think, oh, maybe they're safe. And, of course, when death is kind of floating around, nobody's exactly safe. When did that idea come about?
We always had plans to have one of the kids' parentage be a reveal. That was one of our favorite things, I think. And then the relief of Eric of like, oh, I'm free. This isn't going to happen to me. I'm one of the safe ones. But he does love his brother as a brother, even if they're technically, from two different fathers. And so, of course, he's going to want to stay on the adventure and try to protect Bobby. And that's the humanity in this character, that they are family. And it just turns out that if he'd just gotten off the bus at the right time, he'd probably still be around. But his flaw was that he cared too much. And then his other flaw was that he was kind of stupid. And his plan to save Bobby wasn't maybe the smartest. And he got caught in the crossfire.
We'll get to that in a moment. But actually, I was always curious, was Eric originally scheduled to kind of die at the tattoo parlor?
No.
Because he goes through the ringer there. So he was not supposed to die there. Okay.
That was the elaborate fake out, where it's just like, this guy just had a really shitty day. Okay. It had nothing to do with death or his design. He's kind of, he's, again, not the smartest guy. And he had a lot of piercings, and some things got caught on some things. And that could have gone really badly for him.
The whole notion of it being a family, we already know what the lineage is going to be, because they're a family. So how do you take that and subvert it? Well, there's about parentage, as Guy said. There was one exploration is that they were twins. And they were born very close. And like they always fight, well, who was born first? Who really got out? Like all that stuff. And that they find out for real in the order that they actually die when they're trying to figure out how to save them. But that became like something that just didn't quite work. And it was like a double kill that sort of tonally it hit problematic, because we have this massive double sequence, double header, and it kind of whopper jaws. We just threw that out and just leaned into the idea that there is a parentage shift. That was one of the bigger challenges, is just how do you take the family structure and lean into family conflict? And what is the biggest conflict? You're not my dad. That would be a pretty big conflict.
I think it was interesting because one of the other big tropes of horror is knowing the rules and being able to understand them. And that's where Tony Todd comes in, because he tries to give them just a little hint of things that he's learned. And tell us about that scene, because I think that scene establishes that if you cheat death, like if you die and flatline and come back, like you could be okay. Or if you take years from somebody else's life away, trade for death, you could be okay. Those were kind of the two tropes there. But it was great to see him back in the movies. So tell us about that scene.
In terms of the rules, we look back at all the movies, countless times. The two people that have gotten away with it or could have gotten away with it come from part 2 and part 5. And 2 is the Kimmy character, who we don't see die on screen. And so conceivably she's still out there, which she's actually name-checked by Tony Todd, at least in the script. I don't know if that made the final cut. I can't remember. But then in 5, they introduced the idea that if you take someone else's life, you get their years, but who knows how many years they have left, which is why you have that horribly dark but wonderful joke with them looking at the nursery going, no.
Right.
Exactly. So we just kind of mined the lore that was there rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. And you don't have to see any of these other movies to enjoy this movie for what it is. It's a complete meal. But for the fans like me who are continuity nerds, and my co-writer James Vanderbilt and I did the same thing on the Scream movies. We love Easter eggs. We love like threads that carry through an entire franchise. And that includes Tony Todd, who was such a huge part of this franchise that really gave it specific flavor, in those first two especially. And he became kind of the identity in some ways of the franchise. And I remember it was in John's treatment, but it was something that I had always thought too, is what's the deal with this guy? Is he supposed to be the personification of death? Is he death's ambassador? He knows some stuff, but he's being real close with it. What is this guy's deal? And so for Laurie and I to sit down in those early brainstorming sessions and go, all right, if we were going to give this guy an origin story, what would it be? And then to have that stick and have everyone get on board with it, and then to get Tony to play the part one more time, that's the most special part of the whole process of the movie for me, was that character, and then ultimately seeing that actor reprise it one more time.
Absolutely. And I feel the same way. Writing for Tony and for that character was one of my great joys in my career. And Guy and I, we were talking about that. We really wanted to explore the character of Bloodworth and dig a little deeper, but there's always a danger because people love the series and we didn't want to make a choice that would anger fans, right? When you make a choice about a character, because he always has been so mysterious. Is he death? Is he an angel? Is he just a mortician who just knows a lot about death? Who knows? But based on this story and the scope of the story and Iris, it began to organically come to fruition. And Guy and I just approached it with such love and reverence for the character. We really hope that people will like the choice that we made, and to see it on screen and know that Tony is passed now, it was just really special to work on.
It was great that he was in the film and that you guys were able to film that before he passed away. That was fantastic. I mean, and talking about cheating death, that's where they hatched the plan for Bobby to have some peanuts because he's allergic to peanuts, and there's things with the vending machine on the way there that are almost happening to Eric. But really, the minute they walked into the room and I saw an MRI machine, I'm like, oh my God. Because like the concept of something, MRIs have this metallic thing. You can't bring a cell phone or anything in there. We of course learned that Eric has some certain piercings that are ripped right out of his body that are probably not too fun. What could you tell us about that scene? Because the kill of a wheelchair collapsing into an MRI machine was a heck of a kill, and it was a great scene.
Well, the fact that it's actually happened, that's the thing. Is
with a wheelchair?
With
wheelchairs, gurneys, all real.
Yeah, there have been tanks that have been pulled in and it's crushed people before. So they're just such dangerous items. But just the whole sequence with both Eric and Bobby and what they're doing while this MRI is starting to heat up, it was a lot of fun. I feel like that was the most fun sequence to write. I think in terms of all the kills, that was certainly the most fun.
I mean, Craig and Sheila, something that I thought was really interesting for you as producers, but obviously, Guy and Laurie as writers as well. There's a thing about making a horror film in which horror doesn't always have the right budget. And if you could reuse a location, it's always great to be able to reuse it. It was, of course, genius to have the dream be the tower sequence. And you really spent your money on the Towering Inferno, hellscape there. But interestingly, it's an interior. And like you were able to do exteriors with models and CGI and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that it was cheap, but it was a very smart location to keep coming back to. And the other one that I was really impressed with was Iris's house, because it was such like a Mad Max of a house. Steph, she shows up earlier and then she leaves. And I'm like, wow, that was just all for that one scene. That's pretty impressive. And then it clicked into me later, like, oh, of course they're going to go back. That's the safe place. It was a great way to reuse a location, but it's such an interesting location that you were still able to make it new the second time around and have new fears and dangers. So talk about the importance of that, Craig and Sheila, for a second. And then, of course, Laurie and Guy, to keep it interesting on the page as well.
We should give a shout out to our production designer, Ms. Rachel O'Toole, brought so much of that from the minute she interviewed for the job. Like, she had already envisioned what that sky view would look like. And same with Iris's cabin. But that cabin in particular, we shot in a very remote part of one of the sort of sanctuary during national parks that tourists can't go. And that was a 3-part cabin that they could take up there on a trailer and snap together. So
all the interiors were shot there. It was a practical, actual set inside.
Yes, inside. Wow. We were physically in the rain, in the pouring rain and all the mud, and the 3 parts didn't quite snap together as
And the bears, Sheila, the bears.
Bears, because, it's Canada. And, by the way, in Canada, the only thing they do when you have a bear near the set is send a PA down there with an air horn to just keep an eye out because it's Canada. They don't even care. It's amazing. But in truth, one of the things we figured out was if Stephanie goes up to Iris's cabin during the day, the first time we see it, it will feel like a different location if she goes back at night at the end. So even just that alone changed up how it felt, how it smelled, how it looked, what the wind was doing.
It became the haunted house.
It became a haunted house for the finale. You're not wrong, though. The fact that we were able to sort of repurpose that in such a grand way took a lot of brain power and a lot of scouting, I would argue.
Well, and the construction of the dance floor and inside the bar for the tower as well was just a great set to be able to revisit.
There were 9 set pieces that were built to comprise the entire sequence. There was an actual 100-foot diameter against a 270-degree volume wall of the actual entire set, including the bar, the dance floor. It was all practically done. It was all there for real. But then they had to build the dance floor so that people could fall through. The stunt people, so that was a green screen there. Then we had the elevator set piece. We had the tilted set with people falling down. That sequence took about 2 weeks to shoot. Out of the 45 days we had, because it was so complicated, not just in terms of the amount of shots, but stunts, visual effects, fire, everything. And in terms of Iris's cabin, as Sheila said, it was just kind of fun. They built it in component parts, and then they just moved it up, plugged it together on the location. After rigging it to explode with all the propane tubes and everything, we shot all the interior set in the pouring rain, and then everybody said, all right, decamp. Tomorrow night, we're going to blow it up. We just blew it up in grand fashion. It was hard to figure out that ending and how the best way to get to that ending and to justify getting to her house, because for all the things that make it look like the Mad Max version, is she trying to keep people out? Is she death's an invisible force? Why would she care about all of this stuff? But it's actually to keep people, because if people come into place, they're going to bring death. As soon as she opens the door to let somebody in, she's letting death in. That's why she's been stuck in there for 20 years. But that's a real hard thing to visually transmit. So once we were able to show the different stages that Stephanie had to go through to get in there, and then once she is in there, we realize that death has slipped inside and is starting to manipulate things around in the house, and she's aware of this, meaning old Iris. Hopefully that sold the idea that it's a safe place if you stay there and lock the door.
I've always been curious. Did you ever have a personification of death that you played with?
In the first movie, there's a shadow that was behind people at times. We've played that idea in other movies.
Right? Like the drapes have a little bit of a whisper. Yeah.
Sense of a natural element. The only time there's been a sense of a visual is, again, that like weird presence behind Todd in the bathroom, the first one. Even in 5, though, we just had a guy with a flag go over the light. So there's like a shadow that kind of passes over Candace's face. And it's very subtle, but it's there. That's what's interesting. There was a march in the first movie, like when people were going to die, they quote see death and their face melts, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which we didn't care for and decided to sort of slow walk that idea until we couldn't have enough money to do it. And so, didn't happen. Oh, well.
Well, that was my curiosity. If anything like that was experimented here, and it seems like it wasn't, that's good to know. Editing is the last stage of storytelling. What could you tell us about the editing process? Was there any reshoots that were done that you learned that were necessary from the editing process? And a lot of movies have reshoots.
I would call it additional photography more than reshoots. Honestly, it was much more enhancing than it was like fixing a mistake.
Yeah, there were 2 real areas of the third act, because with budget, it was pretty compact and it felt not as satisfactory. And before, the character of Darlene was supposed to actually die at the hospital. And so after the MRI, they're trying to get out of the hospital, and Darlene is killed in at first it's in the revolving door, and then she gets out and there's a sign for the hospital up ahead that has gotten loosened. The bolts are loosened because of the MRI. And so the L falls on her and squishes her, and that's how she dies.
That's
and
funny.
She takes the L.
She takes the L. That's really funny.
So it was just Charlie and Steph trying to get to this cabin. But as they were testing, we all started to realize that what we were missing is more time with Darlene. We weren't really able to see the mother-daughter relationship through. So then we started thinking, well, let's end with the MRI. That's the all is lost. And then have Darlene be a part of this journey to the cabin. And she is going to finally step up and be the mother. And she's going to stay there and make sure sure that she stays alive and that way she can protect her children. Before, and Craig and Sheila can talk about this, but it was originally shot, and then we had to do inserts inside the RV to put Darlene in there, and then they built a portion of that cabin set. I'm not. You can lean into that and how big that was.
We had like a 50 by 50 foot elevated steel deck on which we threw some dirt. We had an RV tilted over, and we had a big green screen because we didn't shoot any plates, but we were able to find a rollout of a camera that we were able to loop and actually put them, meaning Darlene, in that location that we had wrapped out of 7 months earlier. And that, plus some very strategic cutting back and forth, allowed Darlene to be at the house for the first time. The house had exploded. It was gone. So we built the door and about 4 feet or 5 feet of stones on either side. We had like down to the micron of what we could shoot so we could have her. And when she was leaving the RV to run up to the door, that was just the RV parked on the stage. And we just like put some bushes in front and had her and Charlie walk out and run over. And with that connective tissue, it just sold the whole idea. Plus the spark coming in, everything was down, again, really, really narrowly focused so we could get away with what we could get away with the time and resources we were given.
And you also, I would assume, had her and Steph talk in the house as well, right?
There was no house.
They had always talked in the RV.
It was only the RV for the dialogue. Yes, okay, that's right.
Watching the movie felt that RV scene was so beautiful and so poignant that they just wanted more of them on good terms. So to kill Darlene so quickly, it just never quite gelled. And we actually had, certain focus groups talked about it. They were all wanting it so badly that it just was something that made sense to everybody to get behind. The studio, everybody finally was like, yes, it's worth it to make those adjustments because it delivers this entire family unit. It delivers this emotional impact of the matriarchal lineage of this curse. All of it sort of came together wholesale by keeping Darlene alive for 15 more minutes. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what it did.
We were surprised that the mostly studios, well, let's give it an explosion, like add that kind of stuff. But I give all credit to the New Line folks because they were like, no, let's make the movie better. Let's actually stick the landing, because killing her in such a glib way, like taking the L, it kind of works. But then you have 3 consecutive deaths in 6 minutes and you're numb to it. It doesn't have any value. There's no meaning anymore. So I was really pleasantly surprised at the really vocal support we got to just fix that problem, which the audience was very clear in every test they wanted more of.
And I wish studios would do more of it, because usually only in an emergency situation do they do it. But just like what we're talking about, it could be so helpful for character. I always feel like it should be something that should be officially budgeted.
We agree.
In today's universe, it's such a rare thing. So we felt really lucky. And to me, the amusing thing about this franchise, one of my favorite things, is the kind of notes you get are just so hilarious out of context. So when you get a note that says, Darlene deserves a more heroic kill, like, let's give her a true Final Destination kill. That's insane, but we all were thrilled. Like, it was the best news we'd all gotten, So
was there anything else you learned from the test screenings that kind of was eye-opening?
Yes. The biggest challenge in this movie, and I'm going to let Guy and Lori take over after I tee it up, is we have 17 minutes of an entirely different movie with different characters in a different time period where we introduce people, we get to like them, and then they're terribly killed, and then suddenly, wham, bam, we're in present day. And now we have to ask the audience to go on a second reboot of here's new world, new characters. How do we get them to recalibrate and engage? And that section from when Stephanie wakes up in the classroom to when she arrives at old Iris's cabin was the hardest set of real estate to get even close to right. How many times did we try multiple versions of imparting that information? I'll let the poor writers who probably struggled more than all of us to figure that part of it out.
One of the interesting challenges was another thing that came out of John's treatment, which is way more a feature than a bug, but it was tricky, was that in every other movie you see the disaster and that you realize that's the premonition, then the hero saves a certain amount of people from the disaster. We don't do that here. We have the trick of going 3 generations into the future, or 2 generations, and then having Steph experience it. And we still don't know what happened for real in the past. And so it was kind of like a double challenge, because as Greg said, we've just set up this really lovable couple and their situation and seen them die die horribly. Now here comes movie number 2 with a new protagonist who's the actual protagonist. It's a little like Scream in a way. After Drew Barrymore's death, it's like, here comes movie number 2. And we had a limited amount of space because you don't have the luxury of spending a ton of time there, but you still have to set up, who is this person? What is her crisis currently? Why do we like her? And what is her first move that's going to propel story? And we just had a limited amount of pages to do it. And we were talking about it offline before we got on, like how many versions there were, as Craig just said, to get that right. And then you got to introduce the whole family pretty quickly. But you don't have more than 10 pages to get all the family members in there, except Arlene, who is a slightly later reveal at that funeral. And then all the lore. And then once we get to Iris, then we do get the flashback to what actually happened. It was definitely a tough needle to thread. But, hopefully we did. We got really lucky with casting. Caitlin's such a likable person. Immediately, you're just kind of on her side. And what Zach and Adam were able to do was, we haven't talked enough about what they took from the page and just made real. Like, they really leveled everything up, not just in terms of those set pieces and the kills, but with the characters and the relationships too. They got great performances. So that could have gone the other way. Between all of us, hopefully we made that work, that shift. But that was new for the franchise, which was exciting but scary.
They shot all the cousin stuff, handheld, Altman, overlapping dialogue to allow for that sort of frenetic nature being dropped into a very dynamic family. And she's on the outside coming back into this chaos, lovable chaos, but chaos, and the search for Paco and all of that sort of madness. That helped us as a shooting style to accelerate the information and allow the characters to be a bit more free because we're stacking who's saying what to when. And it set up Paco, which to me, I love the fact that Paco shows up in the MRI sequence because in that one moment, Eric, who's sort of a snarly character, instantly becomes a human being in that one moment, talking about, you don't have to take care of it. I'm going to take care of you. It was a testimony to the acting and I think to the writing as knowing when to pull that card and say, no, don't forget about Paco and what this means to these two brothers and how it's going to impact their relationship. So
Paco, of course, is the turtle who will live a very long life still. And I thought that was a hilarious element that they were trying to go for with, should we kill the turtle?
Paco is not part of Death's design. Paco gets his life.
We lucked out though, because for one hot minute, it almost went away, but we knew we couldn't bear to have it go away. But those turtles are basically illegal in most of Vancouver because people just dump them into the bay when they don't want to have them as anymore.
Oh no.
And yeah, it's a whole thing. So for a half second, everyone was like, we can't get a turtle. And it didn't seem funny if we switched it to like a bunny or a hamster. Like you had to have the 100-year joke and all this stuff. And then because historically this franchise has done additional photography, there was a moment, I'd say we were about a week out from shooting that scene. We were like, to hell with it. We're going to do additional photography. We'll probably do it in LA. They can have turtles in LA. We got to keep the Paco line in. We'll deal with it later. So it was one of those sort of moments of we just understood the value of it and it wasn't worth losing it.
That's awesome.
A guy showed up with turtles in the back of his car and said, hey, pick your favorite, go shoot it. We're like, fuck yeah.
No, they weren't the kind you dump into the bay is how we got around it. So
yeah.
That's awesome. Well, when did the idea of the penny come about? The bad luck penny, which comes into the ending of the movie again, because somebody spends it, it rolls on the ground.
Laurie, that was pretty early in our brainstorms, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't in the riverboat version, but in the version with the sky view.
Because throwing the penny off was a danger.
Mm-hmm.
It was the throwing. If you throw a penny off when you're up high after that on the sky deck, and that I can see you guys going, oh, well, what if? And then away it went.
But it comes back, which is great. Were there any deleted scenes that would end up on a Blu-ray type of situation? Scenes that were shot that you realized either for pacing, for timing, or whatever, you decided to cut?
Just the revolving door sequence, right?
So just the L kill, which will hopefully be on a Blu-ray one day.
Yeah, I hope so. It was a good kill. It just didn't, as has been covered, it just didn't quite give the audience what they wanted. But it was a fun kill.
I'm not sure, just because it was never finished, the VFX. We were lucky enough that we were able to pinch it off early in the process of doing the testing that they never spent the money to complete it. So I don't know whether it would ever show up just because it's in its roughest form in the one cut that does exist and it has temp music and all that stuff. So I'd be curious to know whether that ever escapes the pen and finds its way into the world.
So, the ending is something I'm really curious about because we think that Steph is going to live because, she flatlined before CPR and stuff like that. But it's clear that they died. They're hit by a runaway train as, happens sometimes. There's newspaper articles about it, showing that tragedy struck and it seems like they've both died. I would be surprised if they're around in the next movie. Tell us about that ending, that little coda.
There were a couple versions of that too, I think, and I'll let Lori give her memories. I know that in at least one, that was going to be a premonition too, and it was left ambiguous whether or not they died. And, the fun thing about Steph that I hadn't seen in the other movies was that she essentially becomes Neo in the first Matrix because she studies Iris's book and has the gift. And like in the Julia kill, she was able to pinpoint this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and she was right. She just got the person wrong.
Yeah.
And so she's basically had the veil lifted and she can see Death's design just like her grandmother did. And so, yeah, I was a little disappointed when it was decided that she was no more because I'm like, you could probably get some more mileage out of that character. But I also get that that's for the Final Destination movies, that's the norm. And it is sort of darkly satisfying to tie that off at the end and then just start over with a new group next time. But yeah, Lori, what other options were there? There was at least one where like the train even hit their house in one of the versions.
Yeah, I think it went into their house, but there was.
They're with Paco in the kitchen. They hear the train, and then the engine comes right through and clears them all out.
It was always a train, though.
Yeah, it was always a train. And then other scenes, like when we were working on Howard's Happy House, there were always these train motifs. We were always trying to work in to thread this train that would eventually come and get them in the end. But yeah,
with the idea being that this is where they were meant to be. Like this was part of Death's design all along, is they were supposed to get to the place where they were going to have that moment outside the house and the train would come and get them. That was the ultimate design, was they were to be right there, right now for the prom photos, and then the train comes.
To close the loop, essentially.
Thing we had talked about too that ended up getting cut, that with every kill, like something would fall off. We were trying to make this work, that would fall off and all the pieces would end up in the end in one moment. So it's as if Death had planned it the whole time, but eventually we realized it was a bit overcooked and we couldn't make it work. So we pulled everything out.
We leaned on the penny, and that's why
the penny took over. But it was like an item for each of the deaths would somehow get carried out of the crime scene, and you would come to understand by the end that they had sort of, through whatever random circumstances, all ended up near the train tracks and sort of conspired to derail the train. It was, I can't remember, there was like a stuffed animal from the Happy House, the Dave and Buster's, Howard's Happy House. There was like a stuffed animal some little girl got from the claw machine, and it was covered in blood from whatever death, I guess Howard's death. She throws it out the window, or the mom throws it out the window, and then that ends up rolling down a ditch at some point. And then anyway, I believe the penny was still a part of it, but it was ambitious and cool, but we didn't need it all. The penny itself was enough to convey like this was all Death's plan all along.
But Guy, you said that Howard died by a claw death from the claw machine. Is that what you're saying?
What was his death? No, there was a girl that got a rabbit out of the claw machine like a stuffed animal. But how did Howard die there?
It was bumper cars. There was like this and that happened, and he falls, and two bumper cars squish. Right. To quote you guys, to squish his head like a zit, I believe is how you described it.
That's really funny.
So many versions. Yeah, I can't keep them all straight anymore. But that was a fun set idea. But glad we ended up with the backyard. I think that's much cooler.
What was your toughest scene for each of you? What was the scene that you kept coming back to over and over again? And how did you creatively rise to the challenge? We'll start with the writers, Lori and Guy. What was the scene that you remember rewriting the most or getting the most notes on? Like, what was the scene that you kept coming back to over and over? And then Craig and Sheila.
It goes back to that sequence in the first act, the sky view, right after the premonition and Steph wakes up. That whole sequence from introducing Stephanie, and originally she was at home and she woke up at home, and then we added college. So that whole sequence of establishing her and then establishing the family and establishing what's been going on and her having these dreams and needing answers, that was the sequence that really kept getting rewritten over and over from the get-go. Because like they were saying, it's like a second movie. It's like you have to start over and just reestablish a whole different group of characters.
It was rewritten multiple times all the way through reshoots. From the first draft all the way to the reshoots, there was constantly trying to figure out that balance.
It was a tough one. I think in terms of the set pieces, maybe the third act, because that had a lot of changes creatively and budgetarily. And, we talked earlier about like reusing sets, and we always wanted to end up back at the cabin and make it feel different. And Lori and I always referred to that sequence as the gauntlet. And in a certain draft, an earlier draft, the gauntlet started at the hospital, and there was a lot of stuff on the freeway, and there was log trucks everywhere and stuff like that. The construction, there was a tunnel at one point with a flood, like the tunnel flooded somehow, oil tankers exploding. And then it was like, well, we can do none of that. So how do we make the cabin set as weaponized as possible? And the great thing was we had established some of the things in the first act that were going to be weaponized in the third act. But now Death is pissed off. And I think the reason a lot of the two sequences felt so different is like one is mysterious and creepy, but Death had been kept at bay. And until Iris opens the door, and then really until Iris steps off a porch or steps out of the door, everyone's kind of safe. It's just kind of a creepy set.
Yeah.
But in the third act, all the stuff she's set up to keep Death out, Death is now using to keep Steph and the family out of the cabin. If they get in the cabin, if Death was a person, he would probably be nervous. Like they're getting too close. I don't want them to get away. I have to get them. Otherwise, maybe Death is very OCD. He's got to check them off the list. But it's like then all the stuff we'd seen on the way there, it's like now we get to use. And that was really fun. But the third act, I know we get, it had to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. And then once it finally got down to, okay, we're just doing the gauntlet at that set, there were even a lot of changes from there in terms of what was shootable and what wasn't. And then the additional photography, the thing had blown up. So as they went through, they had to just build a tiny little portion so they could finish that sequence.
Craig and Sheila, your toughest scenes.
Everything they were saying was absolutely a whole bit, but another piece was, in most movies, the person who's left the family, who's come back home and is estranged, is a dad. And so to figure out how to make a mom be like a deadbeat mom and then weave her back into the family and earn her place back was not easy. It's a much different thing when a mom decides to leave. So we had tons of conversation about it amongst us, but also with our actress to really sort a way to make her real and understand why she would do that and then let her back in all in one scene. And so the scene where she's driving in the RV with Caitlin, the first draft was much longer and the actors just kind of went off on their own and figured out how to make it the shortest, sweetest version of it, looking instead of saying, and a lot of just quiet pauses. That really was my biggest challenge emotionally, because if we don't buy their bonding, we don't have a third act.
That makes sense, Craig.
Yeah.
I agree with Sheila, and that was a huge part. But for me, the biggest sort of heavy lift is the scene after Julia has died in the garbage truck, and all the families gathered together. And we have to learn not only that Eric is the not biological son of Howard, we also have to learn about they're going to go to get JB, and they're mourning the death of Julia, who died 3 minutes earlier in a very graphic death. All of these things, the actors have to play a handoff. They have to make sure that all of those tones, and the pivotal actor in that scene is actually Bobby, who's able to both be funny, because remember, all the humor that Eric has, like, show me your kitties, that's just who he is as a character. He's not making fun of the situation. He pokes fun at dark situations, but when he learns that's not my real dad, that gets under his skin. That's a real emotional moment for him. And immediately poor Bobby has to do the baton switch to say, okay, so back to Death and what the plan is. He's keeping us on plot and helping us make that transition emotionally from both funny and terrible and shocking and now plot. And then he's going to have to leave. They want to leave him back, and he has to say, fuck that, I got to go with you, again, because of plot. So all of those things and all the time it took to shoot that and the coverage and everything else to make sure that it balanced out with that tone we talked about earlier, that to me was probably the hardest scene to pull off. It had nothing to do with stunts or effects or CGI. It was just characters helping us with the tonal balance. That's so hard for these movies to achieve. That it was done very carefully, both in terms of on the page. And I remember talking to you guys about what a nightmare that scene was to try and figure out, well, how do we reintroduce this information after Julia's dead? What do we do here? And it goes to, again, a testament to the cast, too. We got really lucky with a terrific cast that was able to handle and manage all of it.
It was tough stuff, but it's held together with character-driven writing and then just extraneous, crazy circumstances surrounding them, which has always been what works about the formula. Again, one of the greatest things about the movie is you don't need to do your homework. This is a reboot. You could walk in cold, and that's a fantastic thing. And it's this many movies in to be able to do that and do it successfully is no small feat. So congrats to you on all that. What could you tell us for each of you that we should keep an eye out for next?
I have a movie called Edge of Normal, which is based on a book that starts shooting in Utah next month. And yes, I have a spec coming out very soon.
Excellent, Guy.
Scream 7 wrap wrapped a couple of months ago. That's in post now. And we are almost halfway through the shoot of Ready or Not, Here I Come, sequel to 2019's Ready or Not.
That's awesome. Craig and Sheila?
I like that they added the Here I Come part. I didn't notice that. That's fantastic.
That's so good.
I mean, Craig and I have oodles of things. You know, the comment I always make is it's like ping pong balls in the lottery machine. You've got to, as a producer, you need to keep a lot going because you never know which one is going to come down the chute. But we have a couple things we're excited about. I mean, Craig, what do you want to share?
I mean, we have 2 specs being written that are coming in that we hope to have out in the next 4 to 6 weeks just to capitalize on the mojo that hopefully the movie will provide. There's a graphic novel that we have some directors who are very, very interested in attaching themselves so we can take that out as well. And I'm not going to lie, we have to sort of be smart and strategic and figure out if there is going to be an FD7, what might that be? Because you don't want to be caught with being asked the question, what's the next one, and have no answer at all. So
I hope there is going to be an FD7. And, you know, Craig also was in issue 1 of Backstory Magazine, which got burned in our archive, and we are restoring it. So you will be able to read it for free. Just check the backstory.net site or the Backstory app, because Craig was cool enough to give us some of his old archival documents from being a development executive for so many years. And Craig's archival documents are cool. Like, it was fun to be able to look back like that. So look, it was great having you all here to discuss Final Destination Bloodlines, and I hope the movie does great because I want to see another one. Guy, Lori, Craig, Sheila, congrats, and thanks again for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to producers Craig Perry and Sheila Hanahan Taylor, along with co-writers Guy Busick and Lori Evans Taylor, for being so generous with their time and coming down to chat about Final Destination Bloodlines, which you could see in theaters right now. And of course, I want to thank today's sponsor, Final Draft's Big Break Screenwriting Contest. The deadline's coming up quickly of June 9th, 2025, and that will give you the possibility of winning up to $80,000 in cash and prizes. Winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold screenplays and option screenplays, and have even been staffed in TV writers' rooms. All you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more about the Big Break Screenwriting Contest at finaldraft.com. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. It's our 13th year of publishing and my 20th year of podcasting, and I couldn't have done it without you, so I want to say thank you first and foremost. And look, if you've never read Backstory before, you could test drive us by reading a completely free issue at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could watch us having our discussions. It would really mean a lot to me to have you show your support for independent entertainment journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2025. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to drop me a line, you could find me pretty easily. I am Yo Goldsmith on Blue Sky and also Backstory_mag on Blue Sky. You could also find me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or Backstory_mag on Twitter. I'm also Yo Goldsmith on Instagram and Backstory_mag on Instagram. Do you see a trend here? Also, if you want to go old school, you could email backstoryletters@gmail.com and I'll do my best to respond there. I even have a Facebook fan page, which is another easy way to get in touch. So feel free to drop by and say hi anytime. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.